Okay, I'm going to make a start. So, hello and a very warm welcome to today's webinar from the UK Climate Resilience Programme. My name is Kate Lonsdale and I'm one of the two champions for the programme along with Suraj Desai, and we're at the University of Leeds. And so this webinar series was set up to communicate the findings of the research that was funded by the programme, but also to host webinars on issues of sort of wider relevance to the UK climate resilience community. So if you're new to the programme and would like to find out more about what the programme's aims are, details of the projects funded and latest news and sort of links to previous webinars, I recommend that you look at our website, ukclimateresilience.org. Next slide, please, Susie. So this webinar is going to focus on an area of great interest to the climate resilience community. So it's about how the government's third climate change risk assessment informs the development of the next National Adaptation Programme. And it will also explain how we can input into this process. And the presenters will provide some early thoughts on the fourth climate change risk assessment. So the timings for today, before we move on to the presentations, I'll briefly mention a few items of relevant news. Then we'll move on to the focus of today's webinar, which is UK climate resilience, UK climate change risk assessments and working towards NAP3. And this will be done in three parts. So first, Liz Bergere will give us an overview of CCRA 3. Then Natalie Roberts will explain the development of the third National Adaptation Programme, NAP3, and opportunities for engagement. And finally, Megan Bickle will give us some early thoughts on CCRA 4 and the development of progress indicators for adaptation. Then we will have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions and discussion, and all the speakers will be available to answer the questions. Next slide, please, Susie. So we encourage you to ask questions. We're using the Q&A function for questions rather than the chat. So please add questions as they occur to you throughout the presentations, and you don't have to wait till the end. We encourage you to upvote other people's questions that you would particularly like to hear answered. As participants, you will remain muted unless we unmute you. The webinar audio and slides will be shared after the event, and then also be available through the YouTube link on the programme's website. If you have any technical problems, please use the chat and we'll do our best to help you. And just to remind you, the webinar is being recorded. Next slide, please. So just a few items of news from the programme. We're heading towards the end of the programme. We've got less than a year left, so we finish in March 2023. And as the projects come to an end, there's a number of different outputs emerging. And we're frequently adding new resources on this page on our website, the resources page. So it's things like decision support tools, data, reports, animations, infographics. So keep an eye out on this if you're interested in these things, because there'll be new things being added throughout the year. Next slide. Thanks. So an example, so here's a new paper that's come out of one of the projects. So one of the things that's hosted on that resources page is about new publications. So this one's based on recent work led by Katie Jenkins for the programme's Open CLIM project, and it was about the development of an adaptation inventory. So it's about documenting adaptation action on the ground in the UK, potentially sort of to provide something like a baseline assessment of the UK stock take on adaptation. So, and also providing some examples of adaptation and sort of that might be of interest. So that's well worth the read and particularly relevant to the webinar today. The next slide, please. And then finally, there's just a new blog that's also hosted on the website. So this is based on work done by JBA, Paul Watkins Associates and Climate Sense, who were the organisation that masterminded the ISO standard on adaptation. And because this is the Met Office's Climate Services Week, we thought we should signpost this blog that's talking about what do we mean by climate services, why do you need standards, and how do you value climate services. Okay, next slide, please. So moving on to the focus of today's webinar, I'm shortly going to hand over to Liz, Megan and Natalie. But firstly, let me introduce our presenters. So Liz Bergere is the co-head of adaptation science at DEFRA, and her team is responsible for the government's statutory climate change risk assessment, so that's the CCRA, as well as for commissioning projects and influencing the wider evidence base that informs future adaptation reporting cycles. So Liz was the DEFRA lead on developing the customer requirements for the CCRA evidence report and on the delivery of the UK climate projections, so UK CP18. And Liz previously led on aspects of EU 2030 climate regulations negotiations. And she's got an MSc from Imperial College on environmental technology. And then Dr. Megan Bickle is an adaptation research manager at DEFRA. And Megan led the government delivery of the third climate change risk assessment, and she's now exploring the requirements for the fourth CCRA and how future national adaptation programmes could be monitored and evaluated to assess progress in adapting to climate change and also obviously avoiding maladaptation. And Megan's got a PhD in fluid dynamics from Leeds and specialising in mesoscale convective systems and the West African monsoon. And then finally, Dr. Natalie Roberts is DEFRA's lead on the natural environment chapter for the third National Adaptation Programme, NAP3. And her primary role is to support policy teams with the development of their adaptation plans and to bring those plans together in a coherent programme of work that will be implemented during the NAP3 period. So that's between 2023 and 2028. And Natalie has a PhD in paleoceanography from Cambridge, where she investigated the link between deep Atlantic currents and climate change. So over to you, starting with Liz, I think.
Great, thank you. Yep, so I'm going to start off by giving a bit of an overview of the CCRA 3. So next slide, please. So I'm going to start with a bit of the policy context here, so and our reporting cycle. So adaptation is a legal duty set out in the Climate Change Act, and what that includes is a 5-year reporting cycle. This cycle starts with the Climate Change Risk Assessment, CCRA, which provides an assessment of the risks of climate change on the UK. So government is required to lay a report every 5 years on the CCRA. The last one of these, the third one, came out earlier this year, and the next one is due in another 5 years. So this report was informed by the evidence report, which came out 6 months previous, so last summer. This was carried out by the CCC and is referred to as the CCC Independent Assessment. Although CCC led this, lots of different people fed into the assessment, more than 130 different organisations. And the last CCRA, CCRA 3, considered 61 risks across 5 different sectors. The sectors are shown on the slide. I use the word CCRA interchangeably, so to refer to either the government report or the evidence report, the independent assessment. Mostly in this presentation, I'm talking about the evidence side of it, the evidence that sits behind it. So once we have the CCRA, what do we then do with that? So there's the National Adaptation Programme, the NAP, and that sets out the actions that government and others will take to adapt to the challenges of climate change identified under the CCRA. And these are published every 5 years, roughly 18 months after the CCRA comes out. So the next NAP, NAP3, is due next year. I won't say any more on that because Natalie will be covering the NAP in her slides. But one other thing worth being aware of, which is part of the statutory reporting cycle, is the CCC progress reports. So every other year, they're required to do a review, assess the progress that we are doing to tackle adaptation, and those reports come out every other year. So the last one was last year, and the next one will be next year. And Megan will mention a bit more on this later, including some of the challenges related to measuring progress. So next slide, please. So the CCRA, looking at all these different risks, is quite a complex challenge. And not surprisingly, there's been a lot of learning and evolution along the way. And each CCRA is slightly different than the previous one. So the first CCRA, which came out in 2012, was really breaking new ground. It was the first, one of the first of its kind. It was a systematic review of more than 100 different risks, and they modelled response functions utilising the latest climate projections at the time, UK CP09. They very much focused on the risk side, and they set a baseline in absence of current and planned actions. So the actions weren't considered, so like the adaptation actions weren't considered under the CCRA, the first one. This actually led to quite a clear distinction between the evidence report, which was focused on the risk, and the CCRA government's report, which starts to look at the actions actually taken. So this was great. This was really useful. Lots of new and useful information. But there was some learning. Response functions didn't necessarily work well for all sectors. In particular, natural environment, it was quite difficult. But also there was a lot of information that came out of it, and it was slightly overwhelming in terms of then translating that into something for the NAP. So for the second CCRA, which came out in 2017, there was a shift in the approach to focus on urgency. So this was to give a greater focus on prioritization to inform the NAP, to really help identify which are the policies to focus in on. And what it also started to do was incorporate the impact of actual actions, so policies, actions, and social economics changes. So that's good because these things actually affect the risk as well. And this assessment allowed us to start considering that. It was smaller in scale than the first CCRA, partially because the other one had happened only 5 years before. And this so really there was only a reappraising of evidence where the science had advanced significantly. So as a result, CCRA 2 was largely a literature review, but with some small scale research projects that fed into it. So we feel like this was a useful evolution. It was potentially more policy relevant. Definitely bringing in some of the adaptation side is useful. However, it's very different than the first CCRA, which makes it very difficult to compare and to see how these risks are actually changing. And also it's the first time we've done it, so there's things that we can learn. So with this in mind, we looked to CCRA 3, which came out this year, and it's very similar in approach to CCRA 2. So it still uses this urgency framework because we thought that worked well, but with some extra focus. So we really wanted to focus on a greater accessibility of outputs for a primary audience of government and devolved administrations. So making it easier for people who then have to start doing the actions to fill out in the NAP, making it easier for them to understand their risks and to take the information from the CCRA that they need. Also, there was recognition that there were some advances in science from the last one, in particular the release of the latest climate projections, UKCP 18. So we tried to incorporate, we asked for that to be incorporated where possible. There was also a desire to include even more on the adaptation action than before, and it includes a framework for integrating this. So as the arrow shows on the side, as we go through each CCRA, there is more and more of a focus on the adaptation action side of things. So next slide, please. So I mentioned that the second and third CCRAs focus on urgency. So what do we mean by this? Well, both of the reports utilize an urgency framework, and this is shown on the picture on the slide. So what they do is they use this framework to look at the evidence and to put each of the 61 risks into one of 4 urgency categories, from the more urgent, which is at the bottom of the slide, you can see the more action needed and further investigation, or less urgent categories, sustain current action or watching brief. So a couple of things to be aware of in this. One, as I mentioned before, this is more than just a strict risk assessment. It is also looking at the actual actions as well. So to show this, the first step 1, is looking at the current and future level of risk and opportunity. And this is where CCRA 1 kind of ended. It did it in a different way, but it's kind of, that's what it looked at. But for CCRA 2 and 3, we then move on to step 2, which is looking at the current action and looking at the current action that's being taken. Does that lead to an adaptation shortfall or not? And then also looking at what action can be taken. So moving on to step 3, looking at what action can be taken in the next 5 years to actually manage that risk. So both these steps 2 and 3 were included in CCRA 2 and 3, but with CCRA 3 there was a greater emphasis and more included on step 3. But with that in mind, the other big thing about this approach is, given that it's largely a literature review of available evidence, there are limits to how far you can go with each of these steps because it depends on how far the available evidence goes. And one example of where there are gaps is in terms of looking at the effectiveness of adaptation action. So that fits into both steps 2 and 3 and limits how far we can go. And also means that the assessment then has to rely in places on expert judgment. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, CCRA 2 and CCRA 3 are more similar to each other. So we can look at how this urgency has changed over time. There's a wealth of other information in CCRA. I'm just going to touch on this sort of comparison for now. One thing to be aware of is this isn't a perfect comparison. For example, the number of risks in each CCRA are not exactly the same. CCRA 3 has 61 risks, CCRA 2 only had 56. And in some places, the risks have been described in a slightly different way, so they're not exactly the same. That being said, it does allow us to have some look at how things are changing. And as you can see on the slide, more risks are included now in the highest urgency category, so the more action needed. So what are the reasons for this? Well, the CCC include in their assessment some thoughts on this. So in some cases, it's that new risks have been added and these risks were considered as more action needed. But in some cases, more evidence has been gathered in the last 5 years. That means we now understand the risk better. So some of them that were further in the further investigation priority have now moved up into the more action needed category. I know it doesn't look like that from this slide because the further investigation is higher, but that's also because some of the lower priorities, sustain current action and watching brief, new evidence had come out to show that the risk has increased or that we don't know, we don't understand the risk as well as we thought. So one of two, and they've then moved from those categories up into the higher categories. And it also, there are fewer risks in the lowest urgency categories. As you can see, they're a lot smaller. Sorry, I should say in this table, they're both purple, which isn't very useful, but the left one is CCRA 2, the right one is CCRA 3. There's fewer in those, although looking at on a risk by risk case, in some cases they can decrease in urgency, but overall the trend is that they are increasing. So that's just a brief overview of one of the many things that CCRA 3 shows us. But then the next big question is, what do we do about it? So that leads me on very nicely to Natalie's section on the NAP. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, so I'm Natalie Roberts and I lead on the natural environment risks for the development of NAP3. Next slide, please. So Liz has already taken you through a little bit of that 5-yearly evidence policy cycle. So we're looking towards the next part of that cycle, which is the development of the policy response to the CCRA 3 risks. So in this case, it's NAP3 due for publication next year. And I should say that this NAP3 itself represents a snapshot of the policy programs and strategies and levers available to address the risks. But underneath that, there is a more dynamic program of work which is tracked and takes account of the changing policy landscape. And we provide that to the Climate Change Committee every 2 years so that they can assess the progress that's being made. So next slide, please. What will NAP3 actually look like? So there's no need to be able to read these figures. It's just to show you the urgency scores that Liz was just talking about for the CCRA 3. So these are the 61 risks that the Climate Change Committee has highlighted in CCRA 3, and you can see that more than half have the highest urgency score of more action needed. And then on the right hand side, there is this figure showing the highest priority risks to be addressed ahead of the NAP3 period due to the opportunities that are available. So the government has committed to a more ambitious and robust NAP3 compared with the previous two, and to address all 61 risks identified by the Climate Change Committee in a systematic way. I've highlighted the risks in blue, where the cost of inaction could be over £1 billion per year, irrespective of the climate change scenario that we're heading for. So these are risks to our natural carbon stores, risks to infrastructure from cascading failures, risks to health and well-being from high temperatures, risks to people, communities, businesses and buildings from flooding, and risks to UK food availability, safety and quality from climate change overseas. All of these are in the more action needed category, and policies are being developed accordingly for all of these risks. And for those risks that are identified as needed, more action now before the next NAP. And as I say, this is due to, in part, policy opportunity. So examples of this are implementation, the net zero strategy and development of the environment targets presents a key opportunity to address the risk to our natural carbon stores and terrestrial and freshwater habitats. And another example is implementation of the heat and building strategy and the current review of the national planning policy framework, which presents an opportunity to address risks of overheating and to our power system. Next slide, please. So how are we approaching NAP3 in a systematic and more robust way compared with the other NAPs? So this is just an example of a theory of change approach taken from UNICEF. And this approach has been recommended by the Climate Change Committee for addressing these climate risks. So using this example, the impact you can see on the right-hand side is what we are calling the risk reduction goal that we're looking to achieve. And moving backwards, the outcomes are what good adaptation looks like for a particular sector. And then we're focusing on the activities and strategies that will be needed to achieve the outcomes and the impact, along with the policy levers and inputs that are needed to deliver those actions. And together, this makes up a policy pathway. And this is being developed for each of the 61 risks. So this is our way of addressing those risks in a systematic way that will go into the NAP3, but will also be part of that dynamic tracker that I talked about at the beginning, where we can monitor progress. And Megan will talk you through more about how we're planning to measure success of these policy pathways in the next bit of the presentation. Next slide, please. So the pathways are being brought together in a framework for good adaptation. This is the one suggested by the Climate Change Committee, and we've used this to design the framework for NAP3. The first principle, number one, is a vision for a well-adapted UK. And this is being informed by a public engagement project that DEFRA is co-leading with UKRI's ScienceWise programme. It's a deliberative and reflective public dialogue concerning adaptation to climate change within England and the UK more widely. This project will contribute to a picture that provides a steer for climate risk owners and policymakers in government from the perspective of the public. It will build on existing research on public perceptions of climate adaptation by translating these into useful insights for NAP3 to inform action. So this programme is underway at the moment. It's due to conclude in June. Next slide, please. And we're now coming to the stage where we want to test our objectives for NAP3 with sector experts and practitioners. We're planning to hold engagement workshops over the summer, and these will most likely be along the themes of the NAP chapters. We'll it's still in development at the moment, but we want to share early thinking on ambition for the 61 risks, well, against the 61 risks, and to get input from a range of stakeholders. If you'd like to be kept informed on the engagement opportunities, please email climate@defra.gov.uk. And I will pass on to Megan for the last part of the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, so I'm going to give a bit of an overview of some early thinking on the next risk assessment, as well as look at the different parts of the adaptation cycle and talk about the monitoring and evaluation requirements throughout. So next slide, please. So as Liz mentioned, CCRA 3 has come out in the last year in its different parts, and the next one will be due in 2027. And so what we're doing at the moment is talking to people who are involved in the process of producing it, as well as people like Natalie and teams across government who are using it to create adaptation plans. And we're trying to find out what it does well, what it doesn't do so well, so we can kind of develop those parts more and figure out how we can support better adaptation action for the next time around. And it's also an opportunity to think about what new research might be required that can feed into the risk assessment and into NAP4 as well, when that comes around in 2028. So next slide, please. Some other considerations we're having are how to include some different things. So Liz mentioned UKCP 18. So the UKCP local 2.2 kilometre projections came out in 2019. And so we're trying to consider now how we can use them to consider risk, which varies regionally and locally better in a national assessment. But this is a kind of, it's a balance between the CCRA is focused on kind of a national assessment, but it's where that can sort of best benefit it. And the other bit we're considering is economic analysis. So there was a separate report this time, whereas now we're beginning to think about how we might be able to embed that economic analysis through the risk assessment. But this is really quite a tricky problem. It's tricky to compare cost-benefit analysis across different risks and sectors. If you think of the natural environment, for instance, and risks to sort of habitats, and then trying to compare the costs and benefits of that to, say, infrastructure and transport. And then we're also wondering how best to measure the cost effectiveness of interventions and how to value benefits of adaptation that will come in the mid to longer term. Next slide, please. And so this brings us, one of the other things we're finding out in the lessons learned is that the steps 2 and 3 that Liz was speaking about earlier, that kind of how effective is adaptation action currently and what more action might be needed, were really quite difficult. And one of the reasons for this is that there's a limited amount of monitoring and evaluation on adaptation action. And this makes categorizing that, so creating sort of standards in that more action needed category quite difficult to whether we need it's loads of action or just a bit of action. So for CCRA 4, we're thinking about how we need a new framework of indicators to monitor adaptation action. Next slide, please. And this brings us to NAP as well, because this is where we're sort of designing our adaptation program and our plans. As Natalie said, we're using the theory of change approach. And a big part of this approach is to think about how you can embed monitoring and evaluating at all these different stages. So they can inform you if the actions that you're undertaking are working and if you might need to change them, and also whether your outcomes are appropriate and you should be aiming for something else. So the whole purpose of this approach is to sort of constantly learn and adapt what you're doing in light of new evidence. And next slide, please. And Liz also brought up the adaptation progress reports. So the last one was in 2021, and that looked at NAP2 and looked at the progress the government was making on its objectives that it had put in there. And so the CCC used this 9-box grid to kind of mark the progress on different risks. And they do this in 2 ways. So if you look at the top of the grid, you can see there's a line pointing from right to the left. I hope it's like that on yours. And there's less progress and more progress in managing the risk. So this is whether we are actually effectively reducing the vulnerability and exposure to that risk. And then on the vertical, we have the quality of the plan. So this looks at the plan that the government actually has to reduce that risk and whether it's good or not. And as you can see, that we have plans of all kinds of different sort of levels of quality, but there is nothing on the far left of the grid. And one of the reasons for this is that we don't have the monitoring and evaluation in place to let us know if we really are managing that risk well. So hopefully, if we produce better monitoring and evaluation, we'll find out that we're actually doing better than we think on some of these risk areas. Next slide, please. And one part that the CCC did as well in their progress report was to categorize the indicators that they use to do this assessment. And they did this using a theory of change approach. So they looked at what inputs and outputs, which indicators were indicators of inputs and outputs. So that's looking at your action. And I've used an example here of overheating in homes and wanting safe internal temperatures. So your inputs might be money that you're putting in for retrofit training. And then your output might be the number of buildings that are actually retrofitted. But then your outcome, whether you're actually you're getting somewhere, it might be the percent of houses where your internal temperatures remain safe. And so what they found by sort of categorizing all their indicators into these different categories is that most of our indicators measure action. So they're the input and outputs, and our outcome indicators are currently inadequate. So we don't know particularly well if we're making progress. They also produced a wish list of indicators that they think should be developed, although this isn't a systematic list. So that is one other thing to think about. Next slide, please. So it's not just the CCC who are encouraging greater monitoring and evaluation. This is also a priority internationally. The IPCC and the OECD are recommending this. And this is because, as I've said, it can support the assessment of how progress on adaptation, and it can tell us what actions we're doing are working and what is not working and is even sort of hampering and causing harm. It can also enhance accountability and show when and where additional action is needed. And if we know what's working, really quite importantly, it's easier to justify funding those actions that are actually going to help. Next slide, please. But it's not a sort of this monitoring and evaluation. It's just not something we've figured out in the last couple of days that it's useful, or the last few years. That there's a reason that it's not kind of in place already. And that is because it's quite a tricky thing to get right. And there's quite a few challenges to overcome. I'm going to go through a few of them here. So the first one is attribution. So our adaptation actions aren't happening in some sort of pristine lab somewhere. They're happening in complex real world systems. And it's difficult to attribute any change you see to your individual action rather than to kind of wider socioeconomic or environmental drivers. There's also issues around if we have access to data that's being collected, and commercial sensitivity can get in the way there too. Adaptation actions can also take a long time to take effect. And so there's a time lag, and that can be a little bit of a problem when you have sort of 5-yearly government cycles. There's also a lack of baseline data. And this is my example on the right here. This is a change in managed hedgerow length. And this is really useful information. But unfortunately, we only have these snapshots at kind of key points at different points. So I think it's a couple in the 80s, 90s, and then it just stopped in 2007. So we haven't had that data since. We also have issues with misattribution. So we can get really focused on the data that we've already collected and that's right in front of us. And this might not be appropriate. We might need to collect new data. And finally, we can't measure everything. We probably shouldn't want to. Next slide, please. So what has DEFRA been doing to sort of try and figure out some of these things? We had a series of workshops in March of this year, and it was to share perspectives from people from different sectors on monitoring and evaluation in those sectors. And so some of what we did was around data mapping to see who holds data and to see whether there's data that we weren't aware of that is being collected. We also shared challenges, priorities, and best practice that people were aware of. And then we also looked at the CCC's wish list of indicators, particularly their progress indicators they'd recommended, and sort of interrogated to see if they were appropriate, as well as hearing experts about how they could actually be developed, which was really insightful. Some of the priorities from these workshops that I'm going to go through now included that it's really important to define what you actually want your monitoring and evaluation to answer. So we should have clear science and policy questions. What was also stressed was that it's important to use existing data capturing structures. So to know what's out there and to sort of expand on and streamline what is already available. And data should also be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So as useful as possible for sort of as many different people in different ways. And then also for our progress indicators, it's really important to account for climate change. And so this means to sort of redefine what good means. So what we're actually aiming for accounting for climate change. So an example would be if we're thinking of habitat and wanting it to be in a favorable condition. We should think about what that favorable condition is in 2050 when it might be warmer and wetter and things like that, rather than trying to reinvent what we had in the 1950s, for example. And next slide, please. And one other project we've been involved in is an international project by the OECD on adaptation monitoring. And measurement is a priority for their task force on climate change adaptation. And this is because this isn't just a UK problem. Less than 40% of countries are tracking the implementation of their national adaptation programs. And we also don't know the quality of that tracking as well. And so this project, one of the first phases is to look at different case studies, and the UK is the first case study they've used. They're also going to look at a few different countries, the Slovak Republic, South Korea, and Chile, I believe. And that case study should actually be published in the next month, I think. And it's a really interesting look at the UK's adaptation cycle, as well as, so it also will report on how Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland also do their adaptation cycles and their monitoring and evaluation. And so this will be followed by policy guidance from the OECD, and they're creating a dashboard that will look at climate in general, but also adaptation. And although this dashboard exists, as you can see on the right at the moment, it's not got particularly useful information. It's all under development. And this is because they are beginning to think about what indicators would be most useful to compare internationally, which is a tricky question. And next, please, I think that's me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Many thanks all. That's extremely informative and a lot to take in. So this is, we've now got about 15 minutes to ask questions and have a bit of a discussion. So I'm encouraging people to put their questions into the Q&A. And while people do that, I've got a question from the, I guess from the programme perspective. You know, we've been running a programme for 3 years now, got one more year, and it's about producing useful and outputs and to support things like the NAP. And you know, it's been something we've been thinking about, like how do we do that? How do we make that most effective? Is it fit for purpose? And so it'd be really nice, and given that, you know, Natalie, you've emphasised the urgency of the problem, and Megan, the data challenges involved. It'd just be nice to get any thoughts on how can you make something like our research programme or future research programmes as useful and usable to support something like the NAP. So any thoughts on that would be really, really good. It's not too much of a challenge.
I suppose because the NAP is formed so much of like a patchwork of all different policies from different sectors, and one of the areas that is particularly useful is where risks interact, and it can help inform policy in a more kind of comprehensive way rather than in silos. So I don't know, obviously we work with our evidence team on how to translate the evidence for policy purposes, but your resilience programme will probably help towards that.
Is there anything about so there's the content of the research, but there's also anything about the way the research is done, or the sort of outputs, I don't know, that could make it more useful for something like the NAP?
I mean, outputs for policy teams, particularly short briefs, visuals, always the most useful, rather than sort of academic papers, which I would say are obviously incredibly helpful for advancing the science, but for the policy side, high impact visuals are the absolute go-to for the policy teams, and then they can go further into the evidence needed to develop policy from there.
Great. Any other thoughts on that?
I guess there's quite a lot of evidence out there in terms of the what is the issue and the risk, and what we don't have very much of is the so what can we then do about it, and it's all this action sort of side, the adaptation action, and how that then relates back to the risk. So any sort of like research that's in that sort of area is really, really useful. And I guess the other thing, we talked about accessibility, making it really easy for someone who doesn't work in it all the time to take those points. And I think that was a challenge in terms of the last CCRA, and there was a project put in to do that specifically. And I think in order to do that, you often have to try and speak to the people who are then going to use it and how they will use it. So there was a project in that where there was a lot of conversations with the people doing the policies, like the risk owners as well. So where it's possible to have a two-way conversation with the people who will help use the evidence as well. I mean, that's always really useful. I know it's not always easy finding the right person and then them having time to speak to you, but where that's possible, that's really, really useful.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, Megan, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think one thing that has been quite popular, I guess, is Nigel Arnell's work was a UKRI, a programme output, wasn't it? I think that's been generally been really appreciated. So something like that, I guess, which does what Liz was saying, which is really clear and quite like understandable for people. I think, I guess we should perhaps verbalize what we want better to you. I think that's maybe a clear ask, which we can do, where we're beginning to think about what research we actually want going forward as well, which we should be clearer on.
Okay, great. Yeah, so Nigel Arnell, just for other people, it was he produced a interactive tool to climate risk indicators. So that's now something that people can play with and sort of look at different areas and levels of risk. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions coming in. Megan, so from the OECD project, can you give us an idea of how other countries are measuring adaptation and what's coming out of the case studies?
We can do in a little bit of time. So the first case study was the UK, and they are now going to do some of the other countries. So I think this will be the UK, sorry, I should have made that clear. The UK case study will be published in the next little while, but they are, I think, ongoing with the others. I think some of the conclusions there were they were quite positive about the pathways that we're using, and also encouraging more monitoring and evaluating of progress. So that call really is coming from all sides a little bit. But yes, I think it'll be a really interesting project to see that and their conclusions that they're going to get to.
Great, thanks, Megan. I think this is probably one for you, Natalie. So will NAP3 provide help and guidance specifically for local authorities? So this is from Kate Locke, and she says she's talking with officers who are working on climate change strategies now, and they're sort of struggling a bit to find what they need. So is that something that
that's interesting? So we do work with the local authority advisory panel, which is sort of the secretariat is with DEFRA, and they were set up to help inform NAP3 so that local authorities could have a say in what they wanted to see. So we're still going through that process at the moment of getting their input. We obviously need something to test with them, and that's in development at the moment. So that testing will probably happen around the summer at the same time as the other sector specific engagement workshops. So hoping that their input will help shape the way that the NAP looks when it comes out and is as useful to local authorities as possible.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. There's a question here about, so I guess it's for you, Megan, you highlighted developing measuring and monitoring indicators. So does this mean that there's going to be more focus on understanding the sort of bottom-up vulnerability? Because this person believes that that's something that's currently lacking.
Yeah, I think we're sort of pushing it at the moment through the sort of theory of change approach, and trying to figure out kind of how we can measure the different parts of that. But I think one of what we want to do as well is a sort of synthesis of evidence of almost everything that's out there. Because one thing that came through the workshops is if you're looking at the range of risks, that it is really so diverse. And as soon as you start thinking about monitoring evaluation, and it blew my mind really that when we started getting into kind of the water industry and kind of it's ever widening a little bit. So I think what we really need to do as a sort of first step is kind of get clear ideas of each of the sectors of what's going on there already, and then kind of build on that as much as we can, and hopefully see those kind of gaps that will come out.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting to see the theory of change process that you sort of set out. So you're going to do a theory of change for each of the 61 risks, but is that nested within a kind of a sort of global theory of change that starts with, when you mentioned the vision, and there's a question here about the vision, and that's, you know, central to the CCC's 10 principles of good adaptation. So there's a question here. So yeah, my question is about sort of how does the vision fit into a sort of higher level theory of change. But there's a question here that's about how you're developing the vision of a well-adapted UK. So you mentioned that the public dialogues were going to influence that, but is that the only thing that's influencing it? What else is going into the development of that vision?
So we, before I joined the team, actually, there had been quite a lot of visioning work going on for about a year, which included stakeholder interviews. It wasn't as broad as the public dialogue. The public dialogue, it has selected people from sort of different geographies, different age groups, demographics, and there were 120 members of the public that fed into that. So that will be our primary input from the public, and then the other visioning work was more sector related, and that will come together in NAP3. As not sure yet how it will look in terms of vision, but that is informing how we look at the pathways and make sure that those pathways fit within our framework for NAP3, which include aspects of the good adaptation principles that the Climate Change Committee have suggested.
Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, so I was thinking about this. So the adaptation reporting power reports, that's all, you know, part of the sort of the whole system in the UK. How do they feed into the NAP? So
from my experience in the natural environment, we don't have too many adaptation reports. But for example, for forestry, the Forestry Commission report is feeding into the actions that go into the pathways, and so they are informing the development. But I can't speak for the other sectors, but I'm assuming that is the same. situation.
Yeah. And there's not likely to be any change to making them more mandatory.
So it's due for consultation this year, the fourth round of ARP. So yeah, you'll hear more about that. Okay. Hopefully probably around the summertime as well.
So there's a question here. Adaptation needs depend also on what we believe will happen in the future. Is there any advice on the level of climate change to which various actors should try to adapt to? I know the Climate Change Committee do have some thoughts on that, but is there anything you'd like to?
Yeah, we are going with the Climate Change Committee's advice for adapting to a 2-degree warming scenario and assessing for a 4-degree scenario. That's the current way that we're doing it.
Great, thanks. And there's another question that I've got, which is around, there's quite a lot of talk at the moment around transformational or transformative adaptation. And is that something that that people talk about embedding into policy or mainstreaming? But do you also try and think at points at which existing policy is no longer fit for purpose, and how do you bring in something that's perhaps more transformational?
That's a really interesting point. We had an intern working with the evidence team on some of these aspects of transformational change, but how we get that into policy is a bit more tricky, and I can't say I have an answer right now. I don't know if Megan or Liz want to pick up on the work that our intern was doing.
I think as well, hopefully in theory, the theory of change, the pathways should show if there's an adaptation gap as well, from what we want, what our goal is and what we're actually doing. So it should make it clear if more action is sort of required. That is the theory. Whether it will be taken up like that in cases is another question.
Okay, thanks. So I don't think there are any more questions, but maybe could you just say a little bit more about how people might get involved in developing lots of inputting into the NAP?
Yeah, so as I say, we haven't, I could say specifically for the natural environment side, we're planning 2 workshops. One will be hosted by the British Ecological Society, and the other is a NAP working group that spans sort of government organisations, but also NGOs and other sort of organisations at that level. And we will be deciding on dates and circulating invites, hopefully within the next month or so, so people can get involved that way. But as I say, if any of the people on this call are interested, just send an email to climate@defra.gov.uk, and we're trying to get a good range of people that are interested in all the different natural environment risks to feed into that process. Because they're workshops, they won't be sort of hundreds of people, but we're hoping to get good representation.
Is that something that we as a programme could sort of put on our social media to advertise it?
Potentially. I'll need to speak to the team, because again, it's like getting the right balance of enough people in the room to make it a really good conversation, but also not swamping the workshop format. But yeah, no, I'll definitely let you know.
Okay, thank you. So many thanks to the panel, to Liz Bergere, Megan Bickle and Natalie Roberts, and for all the questions. So it just reminds me to give a quick plug. So Susie, could you put up the plug for the next webinar? So we've got a couple of webinars coming up shortly. So the first will be, I'll just move that, on the 25th of May. We've got Megan Alexander and Tim Rayner, who are going to be talking about their work. So they've recently finished a project called an Adapt Lock-in. So they'll be talking about potential for sort of locking in and explaining sort of the adaptation gap in the UK. It's a project that I think it was 3 different European countries, and they're kind of comparing adaptation progress, but specifically focusing on policy lock-ins. That should be interesting. And then on the 8th of June, we're going to hear from Paul Watkins. So Paul Watkins has been involved in the work, some of the work on sort of the economics of the CCRA and linking with the NAP work. So that should be interesting. So he'll have a response from Nigel Miller from DEFRA and talking about the economic case for climate change adaptation. So you can sign up for these and any other future webinars on our website. So the recordings and the slides from today's webinar will be sent to everyone who participated, and the link will be available on our website in the next few days. So it just remains for me to say once again, on behalf of the Champion team here at Leeds, many thanks to Liz, Megan and Natalie, and for all of your insights, and for everyone for attending and for your questions. Goodbye.